get a chance to talk to Sara Dosa, the director of this wonderful film. Thank you so much. This is such a stunning and lyrical celebration of two really intrepid people that were so devoted to their work and to each other, and it's such an interesting way of approaching it, the way in which you did. How did you learn about Maurice and Katya? That's always the first question, right?
I first learned about Katya and Maurice actually when I was making the last film I directed. It's a film called The Seer and the Unseen, and it follows the story of an Icelandic woman who is in communication with spirits of nature. Iceland is a volcanic island, and we thought that some archival footage of erupting volcanoes there would help to tell a certain part of the story. Actually, it's the way the film opens. So we started researching archival footage of erupting volcanoes in Iceland, and that's when we first learned about Katya and Maurice, because we saw their footage. It really wasn't until we learned about them as characters, though. The footage was astonishing, but once we learned they were a married couple, they were in love with each other as well as the planet, we thought, okay, there's perhaps a film here. We also learned that they had, recorded hundreds of hours of footage. We kind of put a pin in that, though. After we finished This Year in the Unseen, my team and I ended up pursuing a different project. However, during the pandemic, that project ended up collapsing, and we thought making an archival film during the time of lockdown could be a way to continue to make work. So that's when we remembered the story of Katya and Maurice and got access to their archive and made the film.
And that's the big question. How did you get access to all that amazing amount of footage?
Yeah, so there's about 250 hours that we were working with. About 200 of those hours was footage that Katya and Maurice themselves shot, and that existed in an archival facility in Nancy, France. Maurice's brother, a wonderful man named Bertrand, who actually studies spiders. So imagine Maurice.
What's the family?
He's amazing. I adore Bertrand. But he had kind of taken care of the footage and the archival material for years, entrusting it to different archival houses, and it wound up in Nancy, France, this wonderful place called Image Est. One of my producers, Ina Fitchman, she called up Image Est and struck a deal with them to get access to the footage, and they agreed to digitize the collection for us. Prior to us, about 30 to 40 hours had been digitally scanned, but they agreed to do the entire, it was about 180 to 200 hours for us to work with. The other kind of bucket of footage we were working with, though, was archival material of Katya and Maurice on television, largely in France, but also Belgium, Switzerland, other parts of Europe. And that we had a fabulous archival researcher named Nancy Marcotte who painstakingly called up all of these archival houses in Western Europe, the international, or for example, the National Institute of Audio, I'm trying to translate from French, but anyway, the major French archival house, and we just tried to get any kind of pieces of material of them that other people had recorded as well, since in their own material there was very little of the two of them together, so
Makes sense.
Getting
one is shooting.
Exactly, one was always shooting. Also, that material didn't have sync sound, whereas this material, we could see their personalities, we could hear their voices, we could see how they performed their characters as well, so we were really grateful for that other category of footage aside from their own material that they shot.
As I was watching, I kept thinking, how is the equipment not melting? So what did they do to keep everything sort of functioning?
We wonder that ourselves, and we heard stories about cameras getting, swept away in lava flows, things melting, breaking all the time. But they did have kind of asbestos barriers and aluminized barriers that kept some of their gear from, corroding under the heat or melting with the heat. But they also worked with a tremendous amount of people. They had a lot of friends who were their guides, worked as porters. So it wasn't necessarily just the two of them a lot. There was a lot of people kind of helping out, even though the two of them would often be the ones who really kind of struck out on their own.
So, I was wondering about sort of what inspired you. I know you've done other films about sort of people and their relationship to nature. What did you see in this that sort of fit in with that ecological message?
Yeah, I'm endlessly curious about the human relationship with non-human nature, and specifically how humans make meaning out of and with nature. I think I'm particularly excited by stories that communicate kind of the sentience of the natural world, not just the power, but also the intelligence in a way that's like not necessarily anthropomorphized, but nature in its own right, if that makes sense. And I think at a time when we're really experiencing the climate crisis, getting to kind of show the sentience of the natural world, how alive it is, how interconnected things are, is incredibly important. And for me, there's no more powerful kind of embodiment of that idea than volcanoes. I specifically love how, Maurice says this in the film, that they defy classification, even though it's like the project perhaps of science to classify, to scale, to find models and patterns and things. So I love the fact that these volcanoes are almost like this rebellious force, that really just shows the awesome force that is our planet. So that was incredibly inspiring and intriguing to me. And Katya and Maurice as these conduits for exploring kind of that power through their own love. Their unique way of seeing the world, and specifically how they photographed volcanoes. For me, it was kind of like the ultimate height of all the things that I get excited about and I'm drawn to as a filmmaker.
I was really intrigued by the fact that you had them sort of telling their story through their own words, and you didn't have talking heads, you didn't have experts weighing in. So what was the thinking behind that?
We really wanted the film to feel like it was a co-creation with Katya and Maurice. My other work is observational work, meaning I tend to follow the stories of people who are living through their daily lives. In this case, Katya and Maurice passed away 30 years before we met them through their material. And so we were really trying to find ways that felt like we were directly collaborating with them, and getting to use their footage, of course, is one way, but they also authored nearly 20 books. So we wanted to pull from their writings as well, especially Katya. Katya shows up a lot less, actually, in the visual record than Maurice, largely due to the sexism of the time, and partially due to the fact that she didn't like it.
She seemed more reserved than he was.
Yeah, and he had no problem being in front of the cameras, and she just preferred other things. But it was really important to us to showcase her personality, her philosophies, her complexity, and so getting to work with her writings was really useful for us. Luckily, she was a brilliant writer and often wrote in the first person, which allowed us to kind of tap into that feeling like you're in her mind and in her experience. But I'll just say we really did try to listen as deeply as we could, even though they were no longer here. That often meant admitting what we didn't know, and that was something we tried to actually put into the narration. But yeah, however we could bring them in and use them as our ultimate guides through the story. That was what was most important to us.
I wanted to ask you about that narration because there's so many things that intrigue me about it. I mentioned earlier, it's lyrical and poetic, and there were 4 of you, I think, credited, and of course Miranda July. I mean, she's obviously a writer and director in her own right. How did you work 4 of you together, and B, how did Miranda get involved?
Yeah. We knew from a very early stage that we wanted narration in the film. Actually, at first, I had hoped it would just be Maurice and Katya's voice, and we wouldn't have any narration at all. But the archive, it's so spectacular, but it was incredibly limited. Like I mentioned, there was no sound on the 16mm footage. The other material, them on television, it was often had music running through it, or we were at the whims of the editing choices on television, so we really had tremendous limitations. It was also really important for us to tell a love story and a character-driven love story, and that meant having a measure of interiority, like getting to really know what their thoughts, their relationship dynamics, things like that. And without that in the visual record, writing narration could be a vehicle to actually do that. So we set about trying the best we could collaboratively. I wrote it with my 2 editors, Erin Casper and Jocelyn Chaput, who are just amazing, and my phenomenal producer, Shane Boris. And
so did you take the lead, or how did 4 people work on something?
Yeah, I took the lead. I'm trying to edit myself because it was a really long and challenging process. First, it was really important to us to have a narrator who was curious and inquisitive, who wasn't declarative or omniscient, who could kind of reflect the same kinds of questions that Maurice and Katya had about exploring the natural world, because we had all these questions that we could never answer, the same way Katya and Maurice could never answer all that they wanted to know about volcanoes. So we actually wrote a backstory for our voice of our narrator to help ground all four of us. So that helped us to have more of a cohesive voice. We would say things like, would our narrator write this, yes or no? And if the answer is no, then of course we take it out of the film. But it would usually start with me writing some suggested lines, as well as some quotes from Katya and Maurice's books and some pieces of footage, and then I would give it to one of my editors, and they would try to assemble kind of all of those pieces together. Oftentimes the narration would feel redundant with the imagery, and so we would pull away from that, but sometimes it'd be too much, and so someone would like write a couple extra sentences and be like, oh yeah, that's what fills it in. So that's really where the collaboration took over. But all of us really touched the writing process in many ways through the course, and the process changed many, many times as we continued to work with the material.
That's so interesting. So in the film, Katya says that their colleagues see them as weirdos, I think I remember. And I wondered how they fit into sort of this scientific realm of things, because they were public figures, they were on TV, they were doing sort of the worldwide lecture circuit. So, and I would imagine that some sort of more stuffy academics would sort of look down on that. Were they taken seriously, I guess, is my question.
They were and they weren't. They were absolutely seen as these idiosyncratic people who occupied their own niche. For them, Maurice says this in the film, but they wanted to truly live by the rhythms of the earth, and that meant being as footloose and fancy-free as much as they possibly could, and they found that by selling their imagery, by publishing these books, by going on these lecture tours, that gave them a measure of independence. So they didn't have to rely on government contracts or university jobs. They didn't look down on that by any means, but they just really truly wanted to be out in the field as much as possible, and that lifestyle afforded them that. Some academics loved that because they brought back data. Their filmmaking truly was scientific data. They could capture this fleeting phenomenon to study it forever. A volcano never erupts the same way twice, and by getting, by committing that imagery to this, the screen or to celluloid, really did volumes for the field. They also took gas readings, they brought back samples, things like that. So all to say, there was many contributions in that regard. Other volcanologists and geoscientists thought that they were irresponsible, thought that they were breaking...
Too risky.
Exactly. Pushing past authorities, safety barriers, things like that. So they were controversial in the field too. So like any kind of field or any community, there's a lot of debate, but our volcanology advisors on our project kind of fall more on the side that they are celebrated pioneers who, of course, there's a lot to discuss, but it seems like that's kind of what they're best known for, is their pioneering tendencies.
Are they looked at differently now, 30 years later, than maybe they might have been then?
That's a great question. Now, I definitely think that there's like the glow of, exactly, yeah. I wouldn't call it hagiography by any means, but I think that they're kind of the unique sliver of time that they occupied. No one was photographing volcanoes the way they were, and no one really has again, specifically with the kind of cameras that they were shooting on. Now there's amazing drone technology, and one of Maurice's close friends says Maurice would have been obsessed with drones. I could see him totally getting excited by that, and at the same time, I don't think he would ever want to replace the experience of being so close to an erupting volcano. But there is something about that unique moment and how they lived their lives in relationship with volcanoes in that way that I think that in hindsight is very much celebrated, whereas perhaps in the moment there's still the sting of loss, not just of their own lives, but also there's 41 other people who passed away at Mount Vinson in 1991. But that's a really great question. And I get to see Maurice's brother next week, and I'll ask him that.
Oh yeah. So they were, I was sort of thinking about them speaking from their own words, and I wondered, you mentioned that you met with other experts and stuff too. What did you learn about volcanoes? I mean, you must have come away, you must now be an expert.
I'm no expert. I think I definitely felt that feeling of the more you learn, the less you actually feel like you know. But I am fascinated, like absolutely enchanted by volcanoes. Yeah, and just how the Earth, how deeply connected the Earth is. One thing that I really take away is the life of rocks. I gotta say, like rocks, you can look at them and they seem inert, but there's the whole life cycle to rocks. And I could get into the scientific explanation, but Maurice put it quite poetically. It's not actually in the film. We struggled to find a place for it, but he has these great lines about when he looks at a rock, he sees a life, he sees a memory, he sees a completely different rendering of time. And that theme we tried to really put into the film, but I feel like I look at the planet so much differently now, thinking about where rocks came from, how they moved, and if you could just extend your brain to see in geologic time, everything seems dynamic, everything seems interconnected, nothing is still or solid, so I'm forever grateful for that new perspective.
Absolutely. So what would you like all of us to take away from the film, ideally?
I think for me, I feel like Katya and Maurice truly lived a meaningful life, and they died a meaningful death. And I think so much of that is because they had such a clear understanding of what they loved. It was each other, and it was volcanoes. And they knew that they could never fully understand like the vast mystery that is our planet, but they still went into the unknown, driven by that love. That brought them such beauty and richness and meaning. They grappled with questions of existentialism all the time, and for me personally, and for our team, we made this film, you know, during the pandemic, a moment of fear and uncertainty and loss, and getting to see them as an example of truly going after what they loved and what felt most meaningful to them, knowing at any moment could be their last. I think for me that's a lesson I hope everyone will take away from the film.
Absolutely, really important lesson. I kept thinking too how wonderful they found each other.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
What are the odds?
Yeah, we were baffled by that. The fact that they're born just a few years apart.
In the same city, in Strasbourg.
And they were born in Alsace, but about 20 kilometers apart, but they went to the same university, and what are the odds that two people with this very rare, incredibly specific, found each other, and they not only changed each other's lives, but I really believe they changed the way people see the Earth, so I'm very grateful for that serendipity, and I'm very, very moved by it, and it feels like a form of magic, and that's something that I also hope people will take away from the film and from their story.
That's a great way to wrap up, and thank you for the serendipity and the magic of the film, too.
Oh, thank you so much,
Thanks,
Claudia.
Sara.
Thank you all for being here.